Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Renee Hiatt of American Quilter Society, and we are on episode 7, our last episode of Modern Victoria Hunter Star series. And today we're going to talk about borders. So I only put a little mini modern border on my Modern Victoria Hunter Star, but it's a great time to take you through the proper way to do borders. Whether or not they're 2-inch borders or 6-inch borders, it's really important to measure your quilt. I'm going to take you through that and take the average of the size of your quilt and cut your borders to that average size, and then put them on. This will square up your quilt as you go. So we are going to first prep our border strips, and I'm going to slightly oversize them and then cut them down to the size of my quilt. And I'm going to take you through how you figure out that measurement. So for this pattern, you will notice that you need to cut 6 2-inch strips for your borders. And what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 of those strips. I've cut these and I've taken off my salvage. I'm just going to cut them in half, similar to what I did back in an earlier episode when we were working with our trapezoids. All right, so I'm just going to cut these in half because I know that my quilt should be about 56.5 inches. And then once I put this little mini border on, the top and bottom should be about 59.5. So I'm making these strips about 61 inches, and then I'm going to trim them down to perfection. All right, so I've taken 2 of my width of fabric strips and cut them into 4 half width of fabric. And those I'm going to stitch on to these full width of fabric strips to make 4 strips that are a little over 60 inches. And then I'm going to cut them down to perfection. All right, so I'm going to take these strips. So I have a full width of fabric strip and my just cut half width of fabric strip. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch these together. I like to bring down my stitch size for this. I'm going to bring it down to 1.5. Because this is the border, it's adding that strength. And similar to when I put my rows together, I'm going to stitch in 3, stitch out 3, stitch back in, come across that strip, stitch out, back in, and back out. And that's just ensuring that while this quilt is waiting to be quilted, that it stays nice and strong on the edge and nothing is unraveling. All right, I'm going to repeat this for all 4 border strips. I went a little longer than 3 on that one. And my last one. All right. Next, I'm going to go ahead and press these. Now you can choose to press these open or to one side. I personally like to press them to one side. There's no reason why they should be open at this point. So now I'm just going to set my seam and I'm pressing these all towards the shorter strip, so towards that half width of fabric strip. Give them a little steam. And then a little finishing with the Faultless Magic Spray. And if you want, you could really press the full strips and give it a nice hit with the Magic Spray. All right, I'm going to break these apart and then set them aside. keeping them nice and neat as we go and measure our quilt. So when you have your quilt center finished, as we do, you really want to measure it before you cut down those borders. And what you want to do is you want to measure it in 3 places. You want to measure your side from top to bottom and write down that amount. And then you're going to want to measure your center seam from top to bottom, and then your right side from top to bottom. Now this can be done on a flat surface, or if you have it pinned to a design wall like I do, and you'll just want to take a measuring tape, and I'm going to do the center one for you on camera so you can see it, and then I'll talk you through doing the 2 sides. But basically you want to start at the top, and you want to run it along and make sure that you're not having it crinkle in any place, and come on through and go all the way down. And when I get down here, I'm at 56 5/8. All right, so I'd want to write that down. And then I'm going to do the same on the 2 sides, starting at the top and going down the side to the bottom and getting that measurement. And then doing the other side, starting at the top, going all the way down to the bottom. So now that we have those 3 numbers, we're going to add them together and then divide by 3. So in my case, it comes out to 56 5/8. And I'm going to cut down my border strips for both my sides to 56 3/8. And then I'm going to show you how you will pin that to the side and then stitch it. Once we get those 2 sides on, you're going to want to repeat this process, having those 2 side borders on and going from side to side on the top to measure. Then you'll come through that center again, and then you'll do your bottom. So always 3 places in each direction when you're putting on those borders. So a tip that I like to do, since I'm cutting 2 borders to 56 5/8, is I like to press 2 of my border strips together. By pressing them together, they kind of stick together like glue, and it makes it really easy for me to measure and just cut once. I don't often use my mat for perfect calculations, right? I'm always using my ruler. However, when you're cutting long measurements, it's great to use your mat to figure it out. So we have to do more math here. I know, quilting and math. But I'm cutting these borders 56 5/8. My mat is 24 inches. So therefore, I'm going to need to do 2 times 24 is 48, and 48 to 56 5/8 means I'm going to need another 8 inches and 5/8. So I'm going to do 2 measurements of 24, that gets me to 48, and then I'll need 8 5/8 to get me to that 56 5/8 measurement. All right, so I'm going to start here and measure my first 24. Let me just lay this out here. So I like to just stick a pin where my 24 inches is. And then I'm going to move that along, right? And I'm lining it up with a line on the mat. So there. So I've put that pin on the 0. And now I have my next 24. I just stick my pin in there. And then that pin goes to 0. And so now I have that 24 plus 24 is 48. And now I need 8 inches, 8 5/8. So on my mat, I'm going to line up my ruler with 8 and then 5/8. So I'm putting the 5/8 mark on the 5/8 mark of my ruler on the 8 mark on my mat. So that's going to get me to have 8 and 5/8 inches here. And I cut. And this you can save in case you need it on your other 2 borders, but you shouldn't. They should measure around 59.5. All right, so next I'm going to show you how to put your border on your quilt. All right, so what I did is I took one of my freshly cut border strips, I folded it in half and did a hard press on the halfway mark. And that way I know my top, my center, and my bottom. And I'm going to match that up with the quilt. So I'm going to show you how to put the first 3 pins in with it on the wall, and then I'll show you the pinning that you should do in between. So the top is going to get pinned. And then my center point is going to get pinned. And that's ensuring any extra that has to be brought in is coming in. And then the bottom is getting the end of the strip pinned. So now I'm going to take this over to the table and show you the rest of the pinning. All right, so we're going to focus on pinning a half of the quilt at a time. So we have our center point that we matched up perfectly, and we basically want to make sure that this border strip is pinned to this half of the quilt. If you had a good deal that your measurements were off, such as say you had 56 and 7/8 on the one side of your quilt, that you're now putting a border that's 56 and 5/8, you're having to work in 1/4 of an inch. And the reason that you want to pin it midpoint is so that you're working in 1/8 on this side of the quilt and 1/8 on that side of the quilt. And you don't have an area that's very noticeable that you've brought in a lot of the border. It doesn't seem like much, but 1/4 of an inch is actually quite a good amount across only 56 inches. If our quilt was 100 inches, then 1/4 of an inch, of course, is less to bring in that same space. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, the other thing that I want to be mindful of when I'm pinning is that I don't want to twist my seams. So I'm going to be careful and finding this halfway, right, point, and checking my seams, and it's pressed open here. So I'm going to be careful in pinning this so that those seams stay open. And then I'm going to look at my exchanges. So here on this is pressed this way, my star point. So if I'm not careful, my sewing machine will push that the other way. So here's another place I want to put a pin in to remind me that there's a seam under there that I need to be mindful of. All right, and then the same here. We have an open seam. So I'm going to go ahead and double pin it. Again, I pin a lot, but I'd rather pin than have to unsew later. All right, pressed open, so I'm going to double pin, making sure they stay open. And then also what it does by pinning these double pin is it keeps that pieced quilt that's pressed open together underneath, so it's not with the weight of the quilt pulling apart. So you're always trying to protect your quilt top because you've spent all this time putting this together. All right, now I'm on the other half of the quilt, so I want to check to make sure that I have it nice and laid out, spread evenly. So I'm distributing, I should say, the difference, my 1/8 inch difference across the quilt. All right, so I'm taking care to do my open seams. And now I'm going to come through and check my other seams. And if you want to, you could throw in a couple additional pins. You're probably saying, absolutely not, this is a lot. All right, so now I have it pinned as I would want to have it pinned. And next, what I'm going to tell you to do is to take the balance of your quilt and fold it onto itself. You want to make this nice and small so that it can fit in your lap. And then, if you want, you could probably fold it one more time here. And then you want to roll it from the last thing you're going to stitch. All right? And you're going to put it like a little package. And this is helping to protect that once again, as you go to stitch this border on, you're not rolling over this quilt. Also, you're being careful with all those seams that are pressed open, that you're not putting undue stress on them. And I'm going to keep it in my lap as I stitch. All right, so now I can easily put this in my lap. I will tell you to watch the pins. Ask me how I know. But I've placed it nicely in my lap. So again, it's not being stretched. It's just sitting there. And now I'm going to take my time and stitch. Remember to remove those pins as you go. All right, so I'm going to stitch a few stitches in, a few stitches back, and then come on through. And just remember to remove those pins as you go. And then I just pull up a manageable amount so that it's sitting here and it's ready. And remember, let your machine do the pulling. You don't want to pull this or yank it through. You want to let it do its stitching. And I did keep my stitch length down at that 1.5 as I'm putting this border on, just because that smaller stitch helps add strength to the quilt. I'm being careful to double check underneath my pinning to make sure my stitches are laying flat. And then pulling a little bit more up. Also having this folded nice and neat, like a little taco or package, allows it to move nicely across your sewing machine. Your seams aren't getting caught underneath. All right, moving a little bit more up. Checking those seams. All right, I'm coming up on the end of this first strip, this first border, I should say. Just gonna make sure everything is nice and neat here at the end. Keep it nice and flat. All right, so I'm going to stitch out and then back in a few and then back out. There we go. All right, so I'm going to repeat that for the other side. I'm going to press both my borders to the border, and then I'm going to measure across the quilt to figure out my top and bottom, and then prepare them exactly the same way with all the same pinning. And then we'll come back and we'll finish our quilts together. All right, as we come to the end of our top and bottom border, I'm about there. I know you are too. Just finishing this off. Just want to make sure that you're staying true to that 1/4 inch all the way through. Sometimes we get a little lazy as we get to the end here because we're almost there, but you don't want that last border to be wonky. All right, as we approach the end here, remember I'm going to make sure, one, that it's still truly lined up, right? It's coming to the end here, and then I'm going to stitch out and then stitch back 3 stitches and then come on through. All right. Ah, feels good to be finished. Now, let's talk through some great tips for that final press. All right, so I've moved this over to my pressing station. Now here in the studio, I don't have that large of a pressing mat. Some of you might have a larger pressing station, but if you're like me, which I think most of you are, you only have a smaller area. So it's really important to make sure that you're supporting the rest of the quilt. Especially, this quilt is not as large as some of the ones I make, but even so, you want to make sure that when we have the quilt at this stage, it's very easy for it to get stretched, or God forbid, one of your seams gets snagged on something. Then it's much harder to repair it once it's all put together. So take time, keep it rolled as I have, and then make sure that you have a table next to you that can support the rest of your quilt while you're focusing on the area of pressing. Now first, I'm going to press my last border back once it was sewn, and then I'm going to give the entire quilt a really good press so that it is ready to go to the quilter or for me to put on my long arm. But you want to prep it and keep it nice and neat until you get it quilted, or you quilt it yourself. You don't want anything to happen. You've taken all this time to make this beautiful thing. All right, so similar to our other borders, I'm going to go ahead and set my seam, and then I'm going to finger press, right, and then press it. And you can give it a nice hit of steam. And then I'm going to give it a little bit of magic spray. Faultless magic spray comes through all the time. And I am going to give the entire quilt a really nice press with the magic spray as well. But here my goal is just to get this border pressed back. And you can see I'm just working with the space I have here. And giving it a nice press. A little steam, a little magic. Oh, it's looking nice. Super excited to have this done. I can't wait to see all of yours. Just gonna scoot this back a little more. I can get that last of that row or that border there. Looks good. And again, you don't want to shove the iron into that seam. A hot iron can move fabric and it'll get really distorted. When we have this little skinny border that is really, there's a great value difference between my printed fabric and my border. So if I were to mistakenly mess up that seam, it would be quite noticeable given the starkness. All right, now that I have this completely pressed the border, I want to give the entire quilt a really good press. So I'm sort of going to unravel it as needed and then keep it nice and flat behind me, or in front of me, I should say. Now I'm going to use the Faultless Magic Spray. And I like to use the aerosol at this stage, but you can certainly use the mister as well. But it's just going to give it a nice hit. And I am going to, the part that's on my table, I'm going to give that a little hit as well, because I'm just going to work my way across it. And your goal here is to make sure it's nice and flat, and the Magic Spray is going to give it a nice finish, and it's going to help keep it a little, it gives it a little extra so that it wouldn't be as likely to wrinkle. You're still going to want to keep it nicely folded while you wait to quilt it, but the Magic Spray will help keep those seams nice and flat and wrinkle-free. And you can check for threads as you do this, and nip any of the ones that need to be trimmed at this stage. A little steam from the Rowenta helps as well. And then just always remember, whether or not it's the Magic Spray or the steam, that you want to press until it is dry. You never want to be handling a wet quilt, or you never want to leave a quilt wet from the steam or the spray. All right, so now I'm just moving it up, and I'm just going to work my way through the whole quilt. I'm going to put this through here. So I finished that up. Let's put it up on the wall and see how fabulous it looks. So ta-da, it's finished. I absolutely love it. I hope you do too. Now, you can add another border onto this quilt, right? I'm going for that modern look. So I like the starkness of the little mini border, but by all means, you could pick one of these fabulous fabrics. You'd probably need about 2.25 yards, and you could put a beautiful traditional border on the outside, which would look fabulous as well. You would just want to follow those same tips I gave you for the little mini border, as far as measuring the center of your quilt 3 times in each direction before figuring out the size you should cut those borders. Next, you're going to want to keep it nice and neat until either you quilt it or you send it to a long armer. Pay by check, quilt by check. It's acceptable. That way you can move on to some of your other sewing projects. But either way, you're going to want to cut that backing for your quilt a few inches larger than your quilt and have that ready to go as well. And make sure you put your binding aside in a safe place, because I don't know about you, but sometimes I get my quilt back and I can't remember where I put that binding. So don't forget, we have other fabulous tips on finishing your quilt here on Quilt TV. I thank you very much for joining me for this series, and I hope that you will share your comments with us, as well as any other ideas you have for us to share with you on Quilt TV. And I hope we see you at one of our AQS Quilt Weeks.